nice to be here today. Thank you for having us. Before I start, I'd just like to introduce my collaborator, Harry Matthews, who will be performing with me in the recital part of this lecture recital, but has also provided some very useful wisdom in the development of the lecture part, so he deserves credit for that as well. Laurence Crane's Some Rock Music for Alan Thomas is described in its score as a music theatre for two performers, and was first performed by its namesake, the guitarist Alan Thomas, in a duo with Laurence in 2008. As the title of the piece suggests, it makes clear references to the musical idioms and performance practices of rock music through stylistic imitation, quotation, sampling, and theatrical movements and gestures. Laurence Crane is not a composer who's generally associated with these types of stylistic references, but rather with instrumental works that are often described as being essentially abstract. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss how some rock music for Alan Thomas can be related to his wider body of abstract works by highlighting similarities and differences to his more typical compositional approach, and by discussing how these might affect our experience of the work as audience members. Laurence has himself emphasised the abstract nature of much of his music in interviews. In a discussion with James Saunders, conducted in 2007, he stated, "All my instrumental pieces are, without exception, completely abstract. For me, there is no such thing as extra musical inspiration." It's important here to take a moment to define our terms and consider what is meant by use of the word abstract. I've no doubt that we could use this as a jumping off point for an in-depth philosophical inquiry into the nature of abstraction in music. However, based on the context of the interview, I get the impression that Laurence is really using the term in a fairly straightforward, everyday sense to describe music that is simply more focused on the intrinsic qualities of its material than on referencing ideas that are external to the work itself. So I hope you forgive me for leaving the philosophizing to smarter people than me for today. The quoting consideration was made in response to a question about the titles of Laurence's works, which, as we've discussed earlier today, often name-check specific people, for example, including musicians, philosophers, and athletes, or reference the composer's extra musical interests, such as his love of cycling. Laurence followed up on this statement that I read out up on the screen by emphasising that these titles are either functional or purely arbitrary, and don't bear any relation to the content of the music. This suggests that when he refers to his music as abstract, he means that it doesn't generally include extra musical or intertextual references, but that its essential meaning, if indeed there is any, is contained within the sounding qualities of the musical material itself and its arrangement within the form. In contrast, Some Rock Music for Alan Thomas makes numerous very clear stylistic references to rock music, and its title is very much descriptive of the content of the work. It can hardly be considered an abstract piece, and based on first impressions, seems somewhat anomalous within Laurence's output. We must at this point, though, acknowledge that Laurence has composed other works that make extra musical references, perhaps most notably through his choice of texts to set to music in vocal works. For example, in the 2004 piece for soprano and piano, Tour de France Statistics 1903 to 2003, the sung text is based on sports statistics sung in French. Similarly, in the more recent work, European Towns for three cellos and soprano, the text largely lists the names of various European towns, this time in English. And to that list, we might also add pieces about art, the piece we heard sung by Exaudi earlier, which sets a letter with a copyright rejection letter, as another example. So returning to European Towns, this piece was first performed on the 31st of January 2020, the day the UK officially left the EU, which gives the relatively simple text political resonance in the context of contemporary events. However, while both Tour de France Statistics and European Towns clearly reference Laurence's extra musical interests and opinions, the music doesn't quite have the same referential qualities as Some Rock Music for Alan Thomas. Although the slow-paced elegiac harmonies of European Towns quite clearly seem to reflect the composer's feelings about Brexit, this is achieved in a more understated way that relies on developing relationships between text and music, rather than on overt intertextual references such as quotations and stylistic pastiche. The references to rock idioms and performance practice in some rock music for Alan Thomas rely on intertextuality to a greater extent than works like European Towns, making it seem further removed from Lawrence's usual musical style. Nevertheless, the work also features various techniques that are typical of his music, including repetition, unexpected silences, and use of noise or drone sounds. The general focus on relatively basic harmonic and melodic materials and avoidance of conventional developmental techniques are typical of Lawrence's style. The most significant musical material in some rock music for Alan Thomas, which recurs throughout the piece's duration, consists of power chords on E, G, A, and later D, played by the guitarist, in a clear imitation of a classic rock riff. This riff uses some of the most common chord voicings in rock, is repeated constantly, and has a strong rhythmic drive. However, its elemental quality is not a million miles away from the basic triadic harmonies and simple repetitive rhythms that Laurence often employs in other works. The main difference here is that, unlike triads, which are used in a multitude of musical styles, power chords are unequivocally linked to rock music specifically. Additionally, unlike more traditional rock riffs, the material is consistently varied through the use of differing chords and rhythms, as well as sudden unexpected silences, in an unpredictable manner that's more indicative of Lawrence's approach to musical material. It's further varied through the introduction of a sung refrain on the word yeah, but its character remains essentially the same throughout the piece, in a manner typical of Lawrence's general avoidance of conventional developmental techniques. The other main musical material heard in some rock music for Alan Thomas is played by the second performer, who triggers various pre-prepared samples from an iPod or other media player. At the very start of the piece, we hear a shuffle playlist of pre-recorded power chords. If you wouldn't mind giving us a sample, Harry. These samples serve to unequivocally announce the piece's invocation of rock tropes, but by placing them in this unusual semi-random format, Laurence emphasizes their incongruity in the context of notated concert music. The power chord samples recur at various points throughout the piece, and later are supplemented with additional short clips from classic rock tracks. The samples now represent explicit intertextual references, as the audience is likely to recognize at least some of these recordings as archetypal works of the rock canon. However, they're still reduced to relatively short sound bites, highlighting their strangeness in this context. Another form of intertextual reference is explored in two interludes in which the performers themselves place short quotations from classic rock songs of their choice. The use of quotation and sampling is untypical of Lawrence's compositional practice, which generally doesn't feature such direct stylistic references. The referential quality of the material does feel somewhat diluted by the strange jumbled up manner in which it's presented. This distances the material from its original context. The piece's remaining material is comprised of various short musical and theatrical interludes that reference other sonic and visual rock tropes. These include a pretend sound check, recorded crowd noise, guitar feedback, counting in the beat at the start of sections, mimed air guitar performance, and a rocking out gesture in which the guitarist rapidly strums a single chord as if enthusiastically ending a song. I now want to briefly discuss the overall form of the work, which is illustrated in the diagram on the screen. As mentioned before, this revolves largely around the riff-like material, with the other material, such as the power chord samples, rock fragments, and rock quotations, appearing as irregular interruptions to the flow of the piece. This structure is broadly similar to the formal approach used by Laurence in various other instrumental works, such as, for example, John White in Berlin from 2003. This chamber work similarly features recurring blocks of material that are varied each time they are heard, along with mysterious delineating interludes, although the juxtapositions here are admittedly smoother than in some rock music for Alan Thomas, due to the more delicate nature of the material. The form could perhaps also be related to the verse-chorus structures of popular music, due to the use of a repeated sung refrain which hints at a recurring chorus. However, the positioning of material within the form often actually seems to ignore its typical function in rock performances. For example, the pretend sound check occurs roughly 2 minutes into the performance, where it would normally occur before the official start time of a band's set. Similarly, the rocking out gesture, which is normally coded as signalling the end of a performance, is actually followed by a further 2 minutes or so of music. These contradictions between the material's assumed function and its position within the form add to the sense of its being removed from its proper context. Having discussed the musical content of some rock music for Alan Thomas, I now want to briefly consider what its rock references might mean for the audience and how their experience might differ from listening to one of Laurence's abstract instrumental works. Rock music has come to be associated with various cultural values. On the positive side, for example, it's been associated with youth culture, rebellion, and challenging established social attitudes and authorities. On the negative side, rock, and particularly classic rock of the 70s and 80s, has been criticised for its bias towards white male performers and audiences, and particularly for promoting misogynist attitudes through its lyrics and macho performance practices. Other critiques have focused on the consumerist aspects of so-called stadium rock, and younger listeners may simply see the style as outdated, associating it with older generations. Some rock music for Alan Thomas is likely to bring to mind this cultural context for us as audience members. For example, the piece might seem to highlight the genre's association with macho performance practices, particularly because it has usually been performed by men. The use of power chords, which are a major element of rock's masculinist musical rhetoric, and references to the male-dominated rock canon highlight this aspect of the genre, which is reinforced through the use of gestures such as air guitar that invoke rock's macho physicality. On the other hand, though, these associations are perhaps also subverted by the unusual performance scenario in which they're placed. The constantly varying use of repetition and silence in the power chord riff, the random quick-fire shuffle playback of the power chord samples and rock fragments, and the fleeting nature of the rock quotations all seem to highlight the fact that they are foreign to the musical context in which they appear. Likewise, the placement of the sound check and rocking out gestures in the form contradicts their usual function within rock music and creates a sense of confusion about their meaning. The overall performing context also feels very far removed from typical rock practice, with the performers generally remaining seated and visibly reading from a music stand on stage, and on this occasion with a grand piano in the background, which I hadn't anticipated. This actually owes as much to the traditions of classical chamber music as it does to rock music. It's unclear, though, whether some rock music for Alan Thomas is intended as any sort of explicit critique of rock. Although its cultural context forms an important subtext to the work, there is no clear indication that the composer takes a particular viewpoint on these issues. Another reading of the piece could simply be as a playful reimagining of the potential of familiar materials in an unexpected context. This is similar to a common interpretation of Laurence's instrumental music as a repurposing of archetypal objects, with the triads and drones of other works replaced by power chords and other rock cliches. In this reading, the listening experience is not quite as far removed as might be supposed from the more abstract listening we engage with in works such as John White in Berlin. After all, the triadic harmonies, drones, and simple stepwise melodies that Laurence typically uses in his abstract instrumental works all carry their own rich musical and cultural resonances. These resonances are simply less clearly fixed to a specific musical style and more contingent on each individual listener's subjective viewpoint and cultural background. It's clear therefore, that some rock music for Alan Thomas can be enjoyed on various different levels and analysed from different perspectives. I'll therefore refrain from imposing any more of my own analysis on the work and instead allow you to make your own judgments as we now perform it for you. I don't know whether to leave my slide on the screen or not. Blank screen.
1, 2. Is this on? Can you hear me? Check. 1, 2. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 Hey Joe, where you gonna go with that gun in your hand? Hey Joe, I said, where you gonna go with that gun in your hand? A 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One, two, three, four, yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Now look at them yo-yos, that's the way you do it. You play the guitar on the MTV. That ain't working, that's the way you do it. Money for nothing and your chicks for free.